you. Right, what do I say now? I think the important thing to say is that this book is an edited version. The second edition is edited, and my co-editor is Marlene. And so I think we could perhaps suggest why we wanted to launch the book here. We're disappointed that we actually didn't meet our own imposed timescale to actually have copies here, but we're very pleased that Paul Grave Macmillan have copy edited the chapter written by Kenda and Marlene and other colleagues, and that's available for people today. What I first of all want to say is a very big thank you to Marlene, Patricia, Kenda and Janine here at the University of Ulster, because to be honest, without particularly Marlene's amazing energy, this would just have not come to fruition, the second edition. And so I really want to give a great big thank you to Marlene and to her research PhD students. And I think it's a lovely example of a professor and her PhD team contributing to the next step of theory development in midwifery. So thank you all very, very much for all that you've done to get this to this stage. The second thing I want to say is that, as you will see on the screen, my title is Professor of Community and Primary Care Nursing, and I work at City University in London. And I've been involved in primary healthcare, public health for many years, and I exist in a sort of schizophrenic state when I come to events like this, and experience the sort of midwifery theory development work that's been going on, in a sense, unbeknownst to me. And just to give an example of my schizophrenia, when I was at the University of Hull a number of years ago, my midwifery colleagues there ran a conference, and they asked me, I was Professor of Community Healthcare Nursing Practice, they asked me to chair the conference, and a colleague came, who will be nameless but who works at the University of Nottingham. He came up to me at break and he said to me, I thought you were two people. You know, I thought you were Professor of Community Healthcare Nursing Practice and that you were Ros Bryar who'd written the first edition. So that sort of reinforced my schizophrenic life, essentially. So what I want to do is to look at the background to the first edition, the key features of the first edition, the second edition and the sort of future. And I want to look at this in relation to a sort of ongoing journey in midwifery theory development, which you here are all taking forward and are building on as we go on in this sort of adventure really around theory development. And I'm going to base it on looking at where the first book came from and sort of my career in relation to this book. So first of all, I've titled this, Be Careful What You Wish For, so that my journey of involvement in theory development didn't start 15 years ago. It actually started 31 years ago. When I qualified at Manchester, I did my first degree at Manchester, I was really enthused about research skills, and I wanted to have a job which I could develop my research skills in. It took me about 4 years to get that job, and that job was at Queen Charlotte's, and I was the first appointed research midwife to be working with the midwives rather than a research midwife working with obstetricians, and I was funded by the charitable trust at Queen Charlotte's. And I was appointed to work with colleagues on the introduction of care planning, individualised care and continuity of care. You know, all those things that people are still trying to achieve, I think we could say. I think we went quite a long way at Queen Charlotte's, and we did achieve a level of continuity and a level of individualised care. For those of you around at that time, this was the era of nursing process, introduction of what we call the midwifery process into Queen Charlotte's. Then in 1985, I achieved my MPhil at South Bank under the supervision of Grace Owen, who is a very significant figure in health visiting, and with support from midwifery colleagues. And I had a little write-up in the Midwives Chronicle at my picture because I was the first midwife to get an MPhil. And at the same time, in that era, Mary Renfrew was getting her PhD, and then other colleagues. So in a 31-year period, you know, we've moved from a tiny number of midwives having these higher degrees to the vast number, you know, many of you here today and those of you studying for PhDs. So huge change in midwifery over those years. Then between 85 and 90, I was publishing from my MPhil. I thought I'd put that in. That's really, really important. You know, sometimes we forget about that. And that was about the work that we'd done, obviously, in the project. And then I moved back into primary healthcare. Well, after I left Queen Charlotte's, I went to Gloucester, and I had a fantastic experience on the in the maternity hospital at Gloucester. But then I moved back into health visiting, and I had my first joint appointment as a lecturer practitioner in health visiting, moved into primary healthcare development in the South Wales Valleys, and then unexpectedly, early in the 1990s, I was asked to write the first edition, and this was down to Joe Alexander, that many of you will be familiar with. Joe was in contact with Macmillan, the publishers, and suggested that I write this book. So that was very kind of her. And then I worked on the book, and I was actually then moved to the University of Swansea called something else then, and I was supported by the Dean there, Barbara Green, to actually have some time to write the book. Then I've done some occasional lectures in Hull and then at City. And then, again, unexpectedly, the publishers approached me to do a second edition in I think it's about 2005. We had a lot of initial activity, and we recruited the contributors, and I was very much supported by Linda Thompson, who was the commissioning editor at Palgrave, and I'm particularly emphasising that because the role of publishers and editors in publishing houses is really, really important. And Linda really, again, kept my motivation going over, you know, all these years that it's taken. And then I went to a meeting of the Academy of Nursing, Midwifery and Health Visiting in London early in 2009. And I have to say I was at a bit of a low point around the book at that point because I needed a midwifery colleague, you know, to really put the midwifery to reassure me about the midwifery content. And I met Marlene at that event, and one word I think that sums up Marlene is energy. And Marlene, that was early 2009, and we had the final draft in on the 16th of August this year. So a huge amount of activity then started, and she recruited additional colleagues to write chapters, and it all sort of came to happen. And it's really sort of the speed of activity really speeded up. And we're looking forward to the second edition being published in 2011. I should also say that another colleague who supported me in City is Dora Poco, who was our head of midwifery. And Dora was absolutely central in, again, keeping me focused. This is important for midwifery. You've got to keep at it. And again, without Dora and Linda and Marlene, we would not be here today. So for you, those of you starting off on your PhDs, your master's programs, you need to be, what I'm saying here is you need to be quite careful about what you do, what you select as your topic, because it could stay with you for the next 31 years, 40 years, for longer, for all I know. So you just need to be very, very careful about that. Okay, so the first edition was single-authored, and essentially I describe it as extended literature review. I did try to collect some new information. I put a letter in the Midwives Chronicle, which generated about 3 responses from people who were developing philosophies of midwifery in their units. very much it was based on the work we'd done at Queen Charlotte's, and it was divided into a number of chapters around the process of theory building, and then a large section around the use of theories from other disciplines, which was referred to yesterday by Janine. And then there's the main section about midwifery theory really draws on the work of the nurse midwives in the States, and that was just an example of the literature at that time. So in the early 1990s, the vast majority of literature on theory building in midwifery was from the States. Some of it went way back to the 40s, and a lot of it was led by Rubin and Mercer and other colleagues who'd really done a lot of research-based work over decades, developing their theories. But there was one UK theory, which was Jean Ball's work around postnatal care. And I think that's really important because it was about postnatal care, which is an area which is not often a main focus, I don't think, of midwifery research. And it's a bit of a gap in the literature, I think. And then I submitted the draft, and then whoever reviewed it came back with this idea of having activities where people were to use those activities themselves and in their units to identify their values, because essentially it's about exploring and understanding people's values and how those impact on practice. There were two main paradoxes I felt that came out of that literature, and the first one, and to some extent, the first one definitely had come out of the work at Queen Charlotte's, that there was a conflict between the rhetoric in midwifery, that midwifery was women-centred, it was individualised, it was all those lovely things, as opposed to the actual reality of practice, which was very routinized. And we heard yesterday about the use of technology, the use of monitoring, and the sort of routinized care that can be associated with. And then the second paradox was this idea of denial of theory, and that theory is anti-empathy, that if one is very theoretical, then you cannot be empathetic and you cannot give that lovely women-centred care. So those were the two sort of key themes that came out of that. And just to talk a little bit more about those themes, the first one about the issue of sorry, I'll just go back a bit. The individualised versus the routine care. When I was doing the work at Queen Charlotte's, when I collected all the data together, I used David Silverman's model, which he developed in 1970. Now, all of you will know David Silverman as a leading qualitative researcher, and you'll all be using his books. But one of his early books is actually about organisations, and this is his action approach to practice, where you've got the interrelationship between the institution, the social knowledge, the organisational role system, midwives and women's views and their values and beliefs, and all these things combine together to lead to the action, which is individualised care, impersonal care, whatever it is. So all these things interact to lead to the care. So when you're looking at routinized care or women-centred care or what have you, you have to look at all these different areas to actually understand, well, how do we actually achieve this type of care? How do we get to a situation where we have very routinized care? We can look at all these different elements to try and identify that. And then the issue of empathy and theory. Yesterday, Janine identified a bit of the book which was key to her. And from the first edition, the bits that are key to me is this thing. This attitude says that you can either be empathetic, intuitive and with women, or you can be a theorist, use models, and thus be distant and detached from women. In fact, those midwives who are intuitive, empathetic and love and care for women, and that's using the sort of Erna May Gaskin type language, are probably those who are most concerned to gain new knowledge, to read, to question, to undertake research. So that's where I think we're coming from, that actually to be a good midwife needs to have this integration. The midwife who is empathetic but lacks up-to-date knowledge, who does not think about and reflect on day-to-day practice, is unable to be fully with woman and exercise the art of midwifery. And this is the sort of key message for me out of the first edition. Earlier this week, I was in Pisa and I was attending a primary care conference, the European Forum of Primary Care. And a scientist started the conference talking about primary care as a permanent opportunity for research. And his opening statement was this: research is an expression of care, an expression of practice. It cannot be separate from practice.